Across history, some warships are remembered for exciting service careers. Others are remembered for violent sinkings, or, in some cases, for causing violent sinkings on the enemy's side. And then there are ships like HMS Edinburgh, a ship that had a perfectly fine and respectable career, if one that gets less interest than her sister, Belfast. Yet, it was a career that mostly sticks in the popular imagination for how it ended, not because of the heroism the cruiser and her crew demonstrated during her sinking. No, Edinburgh is remembered because she happened to be carrying a lot of gold when she sank. That gold would eventually become the core of an innovative and dangerous salvage operation decades after the cruiser went under. I'll talk about that, of course, but before that, let's look at the ship herself. Also, I looked up probably a dozen pronunciation guides for this ship, before realizing that even in the UK alone, there's probably at least half a dozen different ways to pronounce this city. And that's before you get into regional dialects. I landed on this one over, say, Edinburgh, but I'm sure I'll have a dozen comments telling me the different pronunciations. Moving right along, though, HMS Edinburgh, a town-class light cruiser, was laid down on December 30th, 1936. In fact, she was the second to last of the type, in addition to being the nameship of her own subclass, alongside her sister, HMS Belfast. These cruisers, as a general rule, can be seen as the British equivalent to the Brooklyn class in American service and the Mogami class in Japan. Well, the initial design of Mogami, before the Japanese gave up on even trying to hold to the treaty limits. This is because the town class were fairly large for light cruisers to allow them to carry no fewer than 12 6-inch 152mm guns. While not quite the 15 guns of the American and Japanese designs, this was still a respectable amount of firepower. The rest of the cruiser's design came out of that basic concept, from the length to the tonnage to the other equipment they carried. I'll go over the other two subclasses in their own videos. For this video, I'll focus on Edinburgh, the last and largest of these subclasses. As designed, Edinburgh displaced 13,386 tons on her full loading. This was fairly heavy for a treaty-limited cruiser, although still quite a bit smaller than something like Admiral Hipper. On that displacement, the cruiser carried the aforementioned 12 6-inch guns, and 4 triple turrets carried in the traditional 2 super-firing pairs on the bow, 2 on the stern layout. It should be noted, however, that some of the increase in size compared to the older towns was due to a plan to fit quad turrets. That idea ended up going nowhere, largely due to the fact it would have been very difficult to develop a quad 6-inch turret. Had it gone through, that would have been a highly impressive 16 main battery guns. In any event, it didn't, so let's look at the other weaponry. Again, as designed, Edinburgh carried 12 4-inch 102mm dual-purpose guns. These were carried in 6 twin mounts, 3 to a side, clustered around the funnels. As for the dedicated anti-aircraft weaponry, that consisted of 16 2-pounder pom-pom guns. In this case, in 2 octuple mounts, as well as 8 50 caliber Vickers machine guns. The final bit of weaponry to round this off came in the form of 6 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 triple mounts. The British, in common with most navies of the time, still mounted torpedoes on their cruisers. That just leaves the armor and speed to round this off. First, the armor protection. This was another area that the higher displacement was put towards. In this case, the main belt thickened to just under 5 inches at its thickest and 1.5 inches at the thinnest. This may not seem like much on first glance, but for a light cruiser, especially a British one, it's actually quite good. Speed, meanwhile, was more in line with typical British standards, with 82,500 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts Edinburgh could reach 32 knots. Pretty standard for a light cruiser of her day and age. Now, with that, we come to the end of the technical information. Let's return to her service history. Launched on March 31st, 1938, and commissioned on July 6th, 1939, Edinburgh was completed late in the game. And by that, I mean she joined the fleet right before war broke out. By September, war would arrive, and HMS Edinburgh had only barely finished working up in time for that conflict. The cruiser would be ready, though, when war came. Assigned to Scapa Flow with the majority of the home fleet, Edinburgh would soon be on patrol duty. For much of September and into early October of 1939, the cruiser watched for German shipping. This, in the end, came to nothing. Edinburgh hunted for both German merchants and raiders, but found nothing. In fact, the first moment of excitement for the ship would come from the air instead of the sea. That was on October 16th, when a German air raid struck the home fleet. Edinburgh took splinter damage during this attack, prompting a short refit to fix the damage. After this refit, the cruiser shifted roles. Instead of hunting for German shipping, Edinburgh would escort British shipping. Specifically, she escorted convoys to and from Norwegian waters. This process lasted from late October through to late November of 1939. For Edinburgh, this continued to be quiet duty. Honestly, as we'll see moving forward, that's true for a large portion of her career. That aside, the next moment of excitement came in late November. On November 23rd, the armed merchant cruiser Rawalpindi was sunk by the Terrible Twins, the Scharnhorst sisters, to use their formal name, although it was Scharnhorst that did most of the work. This sinking would become legendary for the heroism of Rawalpindi. It would also prompt the Royal Navy to start hunting the Germans. From the Nelson-class battleships down to Edinburgh herself, many warships were dispatched on this task. It would not, however, come to anything. The Germans escaped, and the British missed their chance. This failure had little to do with Edinburgh, of course, and the cruiser would soon return to escort duty. For the rest of 1939 and the early parts of 1940, that was about all Edinburgh did. Either escort convoys or patrol the North Sea. This isn't really surprising, as prior to the Italian entry into the war, the Royal Navy had little to really do. Obvious exceptions like the battle with Graf Spee aside. In Edinburgh's case, she would remain on those duties until March 18, 1940. At that point, the cruiser entered into an extensive refit to fix various issues that had cropped up during her service, most notably in stiffening work for the hull. Evidently, Edinburgh and Belfast had issues with cracking in their aft hulls. This refit, more of a top-down overhaul, lasted for much of 1940. The cruiser would only exit the refit in late October, and it wouldn't be until November of 1940 that HMS Edinburgh returned to proper service, although this service would, unsurprisingly, be a return to form. The rest of 1940 was spent escorting convoys. However, this would be in the opposite direction of her previous duties. Instead of sailing to cold Norway, Edinburgh sailed to warm West Africa, specifically to Freetown in Sierra Leone. Considering where the cruiser spent most of her service career, that was probably a nice break for the crew. After this uneventful voyage, there was only one other major bit of excitement, and that was joining HMS Hood, among other ships, in hunting for German raiders near Iceland. After that, the first part of 1941 would follow much the same trend of convoy escort, broken only on March 3rd when Edinburgh operated as distant support for the commando raid on the Lofoten Islands. This proved to be an important mission, largely for its capture of rotors for an Enigma machine, but Edinburgh did little of note herself. This would be the case again during the hunt for Bismarck. Edinburgh was dispatched to cover the approach to Brest, not to fight Bismarck, of course, but to keep an eye out for the battleship. Of course, Bismarck was sunk on May 27th, so Edinburgh missed out on another chance for proper action. She did intercept a supply ship on May 25th, at least. With Bismarck on the bottom, however, another quiet stretch of duty followed. Edinburgh would escort convoys to various locations for the rest of 1941, ranging from Freetown to Malta and everywhere in between. One of these, Operation Substance, saw a close encounter with a German torpedo bomber. That said, the most exciting of these trips was Operation Halberd on September 27th of 1941. Edinburgh was subjected to fierce air attack while escorting that convoy, but she escaped any notable damage. This would also be her last time in the Mediterranean, as it turned out. Because, with that done, Edinburgh moved back north and joined the Arctic convoy runs. Well, she did that after spending November of 1941 on patrols off Iceland. From December 1941 through mid-January of 1942, she returned to the convoys. Edinburgh escorted convoys to Murmansk, dodging German air attack all the while. This was cold and dangerous duty at the best of times, although the cruiser's luck held out for the early trips. After a refit from February to March 1942, her luck would run out. Edinburgh had one more convoy run in early April of 1942. Convoy PQ-14 in this case. Edinburgh had a mostly uneventful time on her own end as she sailed to Murmansk. The cruiser arrived there on April 19th. 9 days later, on April 28th, Edinburgh was the flagship of the escorting force for convoy QP-11. As a side note, PQ convoys were convoys going to Russia. QP, by contrast, were returning convoys. This was an important task in its own right, but Edinburgh was playing double duty here. Not only was she escorting a convoy home, the cruiser was also carrying cargo of her own. This is probably the thing Edinburgh is best known for in the end, because the cruiser was carrying some 5 tons of gold aboard the ship. This was a payment by the Soviets for the war material being shipped to them. That was a value of around 1.5 million sterling at the time. Adjusted for inflation, it's about 220 million pounds in 2024 money, or something like $278 million, again in 2024 currency. With that gold aboard, Edinburgh set out on her final voyage. Within 2 days, it went completely wrong. On April 30th, 1942, the convoy was stalked by the submarine U-456. The submarine knew where to look because the convoy had been sighted, but not attacked, by German aircraft on the 29th. With a target to aim for and a load of torpedoes, the Germans approached undetected. 2 torpedoes would ultimately hit Edinburgh. The first hit her in the starboard side, just ahead of where the gold was located. This was bad enough, but the crew was able to close watertight bulkheads and keep their ship moving, albeit slowly. However, soon after the first torpedo, the German submarine fired another. This second torpedo did far more damage. I think the pictures speak for themselves, really. But, to summarize, the second torpedo wrecked Edinburgh's steering equipment and blew most of her stern clean off. This was incredibly severe damage. Not entirely crippling damage, surprisingly enough, as the cruiser could still use her port shafts. But with most of her stern gone, including her rudder, the ship couldn't really steer, especially in the rough Arctic waters. All of that said, the cruiser was at no immediate danger of sinking. The destroyers HMS Foresight and Forester provided escort alongside 4 minesweepers. This close escort served to protect the crippled cruiser from further submarine attack, as well as air attack from German torpedo bombers. However, as the formation limped back to Russia, the Germans upped the ante. Seeing a chance to sink a British cruiser, they sent out 3 destroyers. These ships, Z-7 Hermann Schumann, Z-24, and Z-25, found the British on May 2nd, 1942. The cruiser cut her tow line, even though it resulted in her sailing in circles on her remaining shafts. Her guns, still mostly functional, fired on the approaching German destroyers. On her second salvo, which would be impressive in normal circumstances, the cruiser hit her mark. Schumann was hit hard and completely disabled. The destroyer would, eventually, be scuttled as a result. Unfortunately, while Edinburgh showed good shooting, and her escorts drove off the other two German destroyers, this luck ran out. A torpedo that had been fired at her escorts slammed into Edinburgh. It hit exactly opposite where the first torpedo hit had been, in her amidships section. The cumulative damage by this point left the cruiser hanging on by her keel and not much else. There was no chance she could be towed to port, and even trying was risking the lives of her crew. With no other choice in the matter, the British pulled the crew off the cruiser. HMS Gossamer and HMS Harrier, between them, rescued most of the crew, 840 men in total. 2 officers and 56 ratings were killed during the attack. The now abandoned cruiser was ultimately scuttled by the final torpedo left aboard HMS Foresight. Edinburgh slipped beneath the cold Arctic waves, and her wartime story came to an end. Not her entire story, of course, because that gold remained aboard. That would become the subject of an innovative and dangerous salvage operation in 1981. That is, however, a topic for a Sunday shipwreck video. For now, suffice it to say that most of the gold was brought up in the 1980s, after which the wreck of Edinburgh was, to my knowledge, left to rest in peace on the bottom of the ocean. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.